And thank you to our music team for playing this morning. And again, as Peter said, if you're here for the first time, if you've been brought along, dragged along, or invited along by a friend, it's great to have you here this morning as well. And it's great to be here myself. I was in Serbia this week, and you'll be glad to know the weather's a little bit better here than there. At first it was just a bit of fun, but obviously as you've seen on the news, it's a pretty serious situation now. And so our friends in Serbia need our prayers and our help. But it's good to be back in sunny England. And this morning, we have the opportunity at the end of the service, after the tea and the coffee, to have a question time in here. It's something we do occasionally. We have a stream, an opportunity to stay behind for different things. So this morning, it's the opportunity to ask any questions. Rob, if we can just have the number up on the screen, if you can plug it in. Hopefully it's working. The number's going to be on the corner of the screen throughout. So this morning, rather than telling you to turn your phone off, I can now tell you to turn your phone on and keep it on silent though. And you can text in any questions about the talk, about the Christian faith, any issues you have, any things you don't understand, any objections you have, and we'll try and deal with as many as we can in the stream afterwards. So there'll be coffee for 20 minutes or so, and then the opportunity to come back for half an hour or so of that. So hopefully that will be helpful this morning. The added advantage, of course, of that is this morning, if you're finding the sermon completely boring, you can be texting your mates all the way through the sermon, or being on Facebook, and I won't know what you're doing, provided someone texts in at least one question at the end of the service. But there we go. I don't know if you've been following the story, very sad story, of Simon Sutton, who died this week. 19-year-old lad who died of cancer this week. And yet in the 5 years during that time when he suffered from cancer, he achieved an incredible amount, not just personally in terms of fulfilling some of the dreams that he had, but also in raising millions and millions of pounds for charity. This is one of his phrases. He said, "I don't see the point in measuring life in terms of time anymore. I'd rather measure it in terms of making a difference." And in his short 19 years, he made a huge difference, didn't he? And what a challenge to us about the difference that we're making in our lives. Are we making a difference? But it made me think, who was it who made the biggest difference on human history? Who was it who made the biggest impact upon our world? As I thought about that, I think actually the answer is this. The man who made the biggest difference on human history is a man who only lived for 33 years. He lived 2,000 years ago. He never wrote a book. He never traveled more than a couple of hundred miles. He never held political power. He never had any material possessions to speak of. And eventually his life was ended by the shame of Roman crucifixion. And yet, 2,000 years later, a third of the world's population claim to worship and follow him. His life has split history in two. The impact of his life is utterly remarkable. In his name, through history, people have founded schools and hospitals. They've cared for the sick. They've ended slavery. They've raised the profile of women. They've fed the hungry and cared for the needy. Jesus Christ has had, I think, the biggest impact on history of any man who has ever lived. And yet for many, Jesus Christ, it's a swear word, isn't it? Wonder why? Why is Jesus, the man who has split history in two, just used as a swear word? We wouldn't think of using Muhammad's name or Buddha's name in such a way. It's funny, isn't it? Not only is the name of Jesus a swear word, but often it's a cause for embarrassment. I mean, you can talk about faith and spirituality and God, but talk about Jesus and people just think you're a bit weird. I was in Serbia this week, as I said, and it's perfectly fine to talk about God in Serbia, but if you talk about Jesus, you get labelled a weirdo. Why is it? Who was this man who, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you're a believer in God or not, has had such an impact on human history? Who was he? And the problem with asking that question is there are so many different ideas, aren't there, floating around. You only need to read a few books and ask a few people, and there are all sorts of different types of Jesus doing the rounds. You've got gentle Jesus, meek and mild, always pictured wearing a white nightie, always with a blue sash around his waist, and he's normally holding in one hand a baby and in the other hand a sheep. So Paul would have been very happy, probably a nicer sheep than that one down there. But there's gentle Jesus, meek and mild. He won't hurt anything. He's just nice and cuddly and he'll give you a hug. There's religious Jesus, on the other hand, who's very austere. He's Jesus of the stained glass window. Jesus who looks very stern. Jesus who has a golden plate around the back of his head and who you wouldn't want to mess with. Then there's moralistic Jesus, Jesus who'll give you rules to live by and will look disapprovingly if you step out of line. Then on the other hand, you've got liberal Jesus who doesn't care how you live. Let it all hang out, do what you like, he'll be happy with you, whatever. You've got political Jesus. Jesus who happens to support whichever political party you're going to vote for on Thursday. That's interesting. He just happens to agree with you. And then there's married Jesus. Jesus who apparently married Mary Magdalene and had children and started a family line. Then there's Gnostic Jesus, Jesus who wasn't really a human being at all, but just a kind of ghost-like figure because he couldn't really be a physical human being. And then there's Super Jesus. Super Jesus really is quite cool because Super Jesus will give you whatever you want. A big house or a big car or a big wife, maybe not a big wife, but whatever you want, you just name it and claim it. If it doesn't work, just blame it. Super Jesus gives you whatever you want. He's like a divine slot machine. You ask him for it, he'll give it to you. So many different types of Jesus, but who is the real Jesus? I wonder if you saw this in the news a couple of years ago. There was this painting in a Spanish monastery, and it had been painted while the wall was still quite wet, and so the paint had flaked off over the 100 years or so since its first painting. And so a Spanish pensioner decided to touch up the painting and try and bring it back to its original glory. This was the result. It got nicknamed the Monkey Jesus, because you can see this rather artistically deficient pensioner had just got a load of brown paint and sploshed it all over this priceless work of art. Although it's caused something of a tourist attraction, Ryanair actually started flying into the local airport because everyone wanted to go and see this monkey Jesus. It was meant to be Ecce Homo, behold the man. And I was thinking, as I looked at that and thought about that, isn't that what's happened so often to the figure of the real Jesus in history? Throughout the centuries, paint has been splashed on through traditions and ideas that so obscures the original Jesus that we don't even see who he is. And so this morning, I want us to strip away the years of tradition and paint and the ideas of so many today and say, who was the real Jesus? Who was he? And what I want to do is try and give you a rounded impression this morning in the next few minutes. Firstly, he was the man of history. There are some people who say Jesus never existed. Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion says there could be a good case made for the fact that Jesus never existed. Now, it's interesting that scholar that he quotes in the book is actually not a professor of history, but a professor of German. And that's quite interesting because there's never been a serious professor of history in our last generation who seriously doubts the historical person of Jesus. You won't find one, because the evidence is so strong. And in fact, the professor that did doubt the historicity of Jesus, that Richard Dawkins quotes, has since gone back on his original claim. There is so much evidence. The historical evidence of people like Josephus, a Jewish historian, or Tacitus, a Roman historian, Suetonius, or Pliny. People who spoke about this man, Jesus Christ. And then, of course, the evidence of the Bible, the gospel accounts. We had the beginning of one of them read to us earlier, Luke's gospel. Now, a lot of people say, well, of course, you're going to believe the Bible because it's the Bible, aren't you? But you can't believe the Bible because it's the Bible. Now, both of those things are a bit of a mistake, aren't they? It would be a mistake for me as a Christian to say the reason why I believe the Bible is because it's a holy book, and therefore you can't mess with it. That's a bit of a circular argument. I believe it because I believe it. But equally, wouldn't it be a mistake to say, well, I'm not going to believe the Bible just because it's the Bible. And many people make that mistake today. They don't even consider that the Bible might be a historical source just because it also happens to be a religious text. But there's great evidence to say that the Bible is a good, reliable historical source. That it shouldn't just be dismissed as the opinions of some religious fanatic. But the events recorded in the Gospels really happened. Luke, who wrote that account earlier, is a doctor and a historian. And he said, look, I've carefully investigated the evidence and I've written it down so you can have certainty about the things that have been taught. Now, some people say, well, the Bible's been changed. It's been corrupted. It's had political influence over the years. But we know that can't be the case because not only are our manuscripts for the New Testament too old for that to be the case, they date way back to the beginning of the 2nd century, but there are also far too many of them for that to be the case, because we'd know if the New Testaments have been changed, because we've got so many copies of the New Testament to go back and check with. Jesus is the man of history. We can't dismiss that. He's a man who you can investigate historically. My challenge to you this morning is, if you've never done it, to take one of the gospel accounts and read it as an adult and investigate for yourself. But here's the second thing. He's not just the man of history, but he's the man for all people. Isn't it fascinating that today, around our world, people in all sorts of different contexts are going to be singing songs of worship to a man called Jesus? There'll be people here in Bournemouth. There'll be people in sophisticated New York. There'll be people in the bush of Nigeria. There'll be people from east to west, men, women, old, young, of every single different culture, who follow this man, Jesus Christ. There is something attractive about Jesus, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. And that was the same in the New Testament when Jesus lived and walked. People found themselves being attracted to Jesus from all sorts of walks of life. You had the religious leaders who would come and have dinner with Jesus, but you'd also have the dropouts and the people whose lives were a mess coming and inviting Jesus for dinner. You'd find a nervous theologian coming by night to talk to him, and an immoral woman sharing about the mistakes of her past. Jesus had compassion for the needy. He respected those others despised. Everyone was drawn to him. In his close group of followers, he had a zealot, a Jewish zealot who was so zealous for his homeland that he would have, if he had half a chance, would have knocked off any Roman he saw kind of walking around town. And on the other extreme, in the same group of followers, Jesus had a tax collector, someone who had, sympathized with those Romans. Both of them in his close group of followers. And fascinatingly, women were drawn to Jesus. So many people think that Christianity is anti-women. And yet, the radical thing about Jesus is that women were drawn to him. They found something attractive, not just about his physical appearance, but about his lifestyle, his teaching, and the way he treated them. He allowed them to be part of his group of followers. He allowed them to be taught, which is something that Jewish rabbis would never allow women to do. He allowed them to support him financially. He never undermined them or spoke down to them. And unlike men, who often he used as examples, bad examples in his illustrations and parables, he never ever used a woman as a negative example in one of his teachings. All people attracted to Jesus then and today. What was it about him that brought this universal attraction? The man for all people. Thirdly, the man like no other. When you start to look at Jesus' lifestyle, you realize there's something unique about the way he lived. He's got every virtue known to man, but none of the flaws, the vices. His teaching was remarkable in that regard. I mean, other people taught, what everyone else taught. They kind of regurgitated other people's ideas. But Jesus' teaching was unique. You could say he never used footnotes. He never had to refer to anyone else. He simply said, "This is what I tell you." And what did he tell people? He told them not just to not murder, but not to get angry and hate people in their hearts. Not just to avoid committing adultery, but not to commit lust in our in our mind. He took the outward obedience that others would have tried to step up to and took it much deeper to the question of our attitudes. He taught that you should love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. He taught that, but the remarkable thing is, he lived it out. You see, we're continually disappointed, aren't we, by religious hypocrites, people who teach one thing and live another way. Maybe you've been disappointed by the church in that regard. And yet you could never be disappointed by Jesus. No, he said, love your enemies, and he did. He healed a man who was coming to imprison him, and then he forgave the people who were executing him. He loved his enemies. On one occasion, he said to the crowds that were accusing him, "Can anyone accuse me of anything?" And no one could say anything. If I was to say that, I'm sure a few people would stand up and say all sorts of things. But they couldn't with Jesus, because he was a man like no other. His lifestyle was different. And then fourthly, he was the man who brought God into focus. How do we know whether God exists? It's one of the biggest questions for any generation to ask, isn't it? It's one of the greatest speculations that philosophers have thought about. Does God exist? How do we know? How do we know if there's anyone there? Well, imagine if you came to my house and you thought, well, is anyone there? Well, 50% of the time there isn't, because I'm away so much. So maybe you're thinking, well, how would I know if anyone's there? Maybe the car's outside, but maybe I went by train. Maybe there's a light on, but maybe I have a security thing in my house. You just don't know, do you? Unless I come out and welcome you in for a cup of tea. Then you'll know there was someone there. How do we know if God is there? We would need him to reveal himself to us. We'd need him to show up. We'd need him to make it clear. And the person of Jesus makes it clear. Because this is the claim that God has stepped into our worlds, that he has showed up. Now you might be saying, come on. I'm an intelligent person. I live in the 21st century. I can't believe ridiculous claims like God becoming a human being and living. Come on, I can't believe that. Look, I don't expect you to believe it because it's easy. The first followers of Jesus didn't believe it because it was easy. In fact, for them to believe that Jesus was God was probably a bigger step than it would be for you. Think of it. Most of the first followers of Jesus were Jews. The one thing they had learned after 2,000 years of Old Testament history was that there was one God, that there was no other. And so for them to believe that somehow the one God had become a human being, had lived amongst them, and then had died on a Roman cross and risen from the dead, was totally outrageous in terms of their expectations. They didn't believe it because it was easy. In fact, if you read the Gospels, you see how hard it was for them to come to that conclusion. And yet they did come to that conclusion eventually. Why? Because the evidence led to it. They were utterly convinced by two things. Firstly, Jesus' claims. Jesus again and again claimed the kind of things that only God could claim. He took the name of God, the I am from the Old Testament, and he applied it repeatedly to himself. He said that he and God were one. He offered to forgive people's sins, people who he'd never met before. He accepted people's worship. And he said that he was going to be the judge at the end of history. Now, you might be familiar with some of those claims because maybe you've read the Bible, but have you ever wondered how outrageous those claims would be if anyone else were to make them? I mean, imagine if I were to make them. I was to stand here this morning and say, me and God, we're like that, we are. And actually, I am God. And if you've met me, you've met God. And actually, if you sinned, it's all right, I'll forgive you. And imagine if you came up to me for some reason at the end of the service, I don't know why, and started worshipping me. That's never happened, you'll be glad to know, but imagine if you did, Imagine if I not only accepted your worship, but then rebuked you for taking so long to do it. You'd be calling in the men in white coats, wouldn't you? This guy's off his head. And then if I was to claim that one day I was going to be the judge of history, and you shouldn't judge other people because I'll do it for you, well, that's just ridiculous. And yet no one thought Jesus was off his head. No one thought he was crazy. Because he didn't just make those kind of claims. For anyone can make them. Words are words. But he backed them up with the things that he did. He had a unique authority. He had authority over evil. He could transform people's lives who had been gripped by evil desires and forces. He had authority over nature. He could calm a raging storm just with a word. In Serbia this week, we were kind of wishing we could do that. But we couldn't. He had authority over sickness. He could heal the sick, not just someone who might have a kind of dodgy back or one leg longer than the other, but a paralytic walking, a blind man seeing, a deaf man hearing, a dumb man speaking. He could heal the sick. He had authority to take a little boy's packed lunch and feed, 5,000 men, probably 20,000 once you include the women and the children, with a few loaves and fishes. And he had authority over death. He could walk into a funeral service and cancel the whole thing with a word. What an incredible authority. And by the way, notice how he uses it. If I had that kind of power, maybe if you had that kind of power, you'd think, wouldn't it be great? Imagine what I could do if I had that kind of power. What did Jesus do? He always used it for the benefit of others and never for the benefit of himself. In fact, when he was encouraged on several occasions to use his powers for his own benefit, he never did. Incredible power demonstrated through incredible love. And the question that the followers of Jesus asked repeatedly was, who is this? And the conclusion that they eventually came to was that God, the one and only, had shown up in the person of Jesus Christ. He is the man that brings God into focus. If you want to know what God's like, look at Jesus. You find that hard to understand? Well, so did they. But they discovered that in the man of Jesus of Nazareth, they could get to know God himself. Not everything there's ever to know about God, but enough to get going. He brings God into focus. He's also the man on the cross. You see, Jesus lived 33 years, only 3 years in public limelight, and yet at the end of that, he's executed. Why? Because the authorities caught up with him? Because he had it coming to him? Was it an accident? Back at the turn of the millennium, when they had the Millennium Dome, before it was all sorts of other things, down in London, they had in the Millennium Dome an exhibition. And in that exhibition, there was a religious part of it. And in the religious part, there was a Christian part. And in the Christian part, there was a bit about Jesus. And it said, apparently, for I never wasted my money going there, it said this about Jesus. It said, Jesus was a good man who died young. A sad accident. A tragic mistake. And yet Jesus never said so. You see, Jesus didn't lose his life. He didn't take his life. He gave his life. He knew he was going to do it. He predicted it on several occasions. You see, Jesus had shown up by his teaching, but also by his perfect example, the dark side of human nature. I think that's one of the reasons why people don't like Jesus. Because in the light of his presence, the dark areas of our lives are shown up for what they are. And Jesus said the way he was going to deal with that, the mess, the darkness, the dirt in our lives, was by going to a cross. His purpose in coming into the world was not to defeat and kill his enemies, but to die at the hands of his enemies, to turn enemies into friends. He went to the cross deliberately for us, because none of us are the people we should be. Compared to his example, all of us fall short. And yet so often we content ourselves with comparing ourselves with others. That makes us feel better. But compared to him, and the Bible says this dirt, this rubbish, this sin, to use the Bible's word, it separated us from God. It's like the clouds that will probably appear tomorrow and block off this beautiful sunlight. The sun will still be there. It hasn't disappeared, it hasn't gone. It's just that there's a barrier in the way that means that we don't feel its presence or its warmth. The Bible says our sin and wrong is like that. A barrier that separates us from God. He's still there, but we don't feel it. We can't experience his presence, his warmth, because of that barrier. Someone once said Jesus laid down his cross and turned the wood of his cross into a bridge, to bridge that barrier, to bring us back to God. He reached down into the mess of this world. Sorry, this is a bit of a gross illustration, but it makes the point. When we were in Romania running camps a few years ago, in the camp, the toilet facilities weren't very good, and the flush wouldn't always work so well. And so there were some occasions when the toilets would get blocked. And so it was always a case of drawing the short straw amongst the leaders, who would have to put the bin bags up their arm and then reach down into that U-bend and unblock the toilets. Sorry, none of you want Sunday lunch. To reach down into that filth and unblock the mess. And yet, this is the incredible claim that God, who was perfect and spotless, came down into our filth. Didn't protect himself from it, but he allowed the filth of all of our lives, all of our sin and wrong, to be literally emptied over him so that we might not have to face it. You see, religion will give you good moral teaching, but it won't give you forgiveness. That's what Jesus offers. Think of a friend of mine in Bosnia, and he said that after the war in the former Yugoslavia, he was racked with guilt. He'd been a sniper in the army. He'd killed many people. He was overwhelmed by guilt, and yet he said when he came to know Jesus, his guilt melted away like the snow in the springtime. He came to forgive us. I was chatting to a lad this week who just came into the events that we were running in Novi Sad. Never been to a Christian event before. And yet we spoke about Jesus. I spoke about this message of forgiveness. And at the end he said to me these words. He said, "This changes everything." He said, "I always thought that God's love was something I had to earn. I never realized it was a gift that I could receive." He said, "I've spent my life punishing myself, trying to make up for the things that I've done. But you're telling me that Jesus has done everything so I can know him." You could see in his eyes the joy of the realization of that fact. Have you ever realized that? He's the man on the cross. And then he's the man who defeated death. You see, if the cross was the end of the story, we wouldn't be sitting here today. There'd be no Christianity, there'd be no church. The whole thing would have stopped 2,000 years ago in a very abrupt end. For Jewish people to go on believing that Jesus was the Messiah after the cross, without the resurrection, it would have never happened. And yet the claim is that he didn't just die, but he rose again. Now at this point you're saying, well, now you really are getting ridiculous, Michael. How do you expect me to believe something like that? Nice story. And yet the claim of Christians down through history has been that this really happened. Not just in some fluffy spiritual way, not just in a kind of metaphorical way, but in a real, physical, touchable way. Jesus rose from the dead. And get this, the people that I meet that find this most ridiculous are not the people who've investigated it the most. They're not the historians that have looked into all the evidence and know better than us what's really involved. But actually the people that find it most ridiculous are often the people that have never looked into it. We just copy the assumptions of everyone else in our materialistic society. And actually, the people that have looked into it the most are the people that give it the most time. And actually, there have been many people who have looked into it in great detail trying to prove it wrong, who've been convinced otherwise because of the evidence that they found there. See, actually, even amongst scholars who don't even believe in the resurrection, there are certain things that almost everyone agrees upon. Jesus lived. He died. He was buried. His tomb was found empty by women 3 days later. People claim that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And because of their testimony, this whole movement of Christianity began and spread in the very city where it happened, despite the strongest opposition and persecution for 300 years. Why? What accounts for these things in history? Well, as one person said, what we have is a resurrection-sized hole in history, and only the resurrection fits it. It actually happened. The alternatives don't stand up. He's the man who conquered death, which means that he's the man who can conquer our death and offer hope in the face of it on a week when we've been confronted by the reality of it for a young 19-year-old, and the week before for an athletic tennis player. Because it will happen to all of us eventually. And Jesus says he's not only got the answer, he is the answer. Which means finally, he's also the man at the door. You see, in the last book of the Bible, there's something that Jesus says to a group of people living in, present-day Turkey. But actually, he's saying it not just to them then, he's saying it to all of us now. The risen Jesus, this is after the resurrection, says this. He says, I stand at the door and I knock. And if anyone hears my voice, I'll come in and I'll eat with them and they with me. Jesus isn't talking about the physical houses where we live. He's talking about the house of our lives. He says, look, I've risen from the dead. I'm alive. I'm real. But I want to be real for you. I want to come into your life. And notice what he says. I want to come in and do what? Have a meal with you. What a wonderful picture. Jesus doesn't want to come in and ruin our lives. So many people think that. He's come to be the cosmic killjoy, the man with the rule book. No, he's the man with dinner. He's come with the steak. He's come to fill our lives with good things. He's come with himself. And he knocks at the door. There was a painter called Holman Hunt. He painted a very famous painting of this image from Revelation. There's Jesus, the light of the world. That's the name of the painting, the light of the world. And he's knocking at the door. And there's no handle on the outside, because the handle's on the inside. He knocks at the door, but it's our job to open that door. Have you ever opened the door? Have you ever invited Jesus into your life? He won't force his way in. He's a perfect gentleman. He's not going to break the door down. But he knocks. And he says, will you invite me in? I wonder what you're thinking about that. Maybe you're saying, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether this is true. I mean, you've gone over some pretty big stuff this morning, and I haven't had time to really think it through. Well, of course you can, and you should think these things through. And Christianity, if it's true, is worth thinking through and asking all those big and serious questions of. Truth has nothing to fear from questions. You can ask the questions later. But you don't have to wait until all your doubts have been answered, all your questions have been dealt with, to open the door. With as much as you know and as best as you know how, you can do that. Because he's also the man that's patient. There's a man who came to Jesus once, and Jesus said, do you believe? And this man said to Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. What did Jesus say? Did he say, come back when you're a bit more certain? No. He welcomed him. With his doubts, with his questions. And he'll welcome you with your doubts and questions this morning. Maybe you want to say to God, I'm not sure you're there. I'm not sure this is real, but if you are, I want to invite you in. He will. And you'll know not just intellectually, although you can, but you'll know from experience the reality of his presence. Maybe you're worried about the change that he'll bring. What would it mean? Would I have to become religious? Would I have to become weird? Would I have to start wearing socks with sandals? Well, thankfully not. Yeah, we're worried about the changes Jesus will make, aren't we? Is he going to ruin my fun? Someone put it this way, Jesus is the man with the hoover. He wants to hoover up the rubbish, but he won't suck up the carpets. He'll get rid of the rubbish in your life, but he won't get rid of what's good. But he'll take what's good and he'll enhance it and transform it in a way that you never thought possible. Not make you less yourself, but more yourself. You don't need to be afraid of change. Maybe you're afraid of what other people will think. What will my friends think, my family think? For some of us, that's on the level of fairly trivial, isn't it? Maybe we'll just get a bit laughed at. And I always say, if a friend's worthy of the name friend, well, they'll stick with you if you make that decision. For others, maybe from other cultures particularly, that's a much bigger challenge, because we could face the loss of family and friends quite seriously if we were to follow Jesus Christ. Can I say that's been the norm for most followers of Jesus through history? The culture in Britain is the exception, not the rule. And yet Jesus said that the blessings of following him outweigh the costs of following him. And the costs of not following him are far greater than the cost of following him. And he's also the man who'll stick with you. He's not just the man who gets you going, who comes in for dinner and then leaves you with the washing up. He's the man who will come and stay and never leave you. Think of a friend of mine from a country in the Middle East who, when he became a Christian, was told to leave by his family. His dad tried to kill him. He's never seen his family since. And yet he said, in Jesus, I've got a friend that's never left me. And in the church, I have a family that are always there for me. Have you ever opened the door and invited him in? Why not? Maybe you've been a Christian for years. Maybe you did that years ago. My challenge to you would be just this. Maybe you invited him years ago, but maybe you're still holding keys to some of the rooms in the house. Maybe there's that cupboard under the stairs, and you don't want Jesus going in there. Or there's that attic room with some stuff up there, and no, he can't see that. Do you not think, from what we've heard this morning, that Jesus is someone who you can trust with every aspect of your life? And so why not this morning, afresh, hand over all the keys? Stop keeping those secret rooms. Invite him in. He'll get rid of the rubbish, but he won't get rid of what's good. Let's have a moment to pause and think. Maybe we want to close our eyes. And just a chance to think, have you ever responded to that invitation? Have you ever opened the door? Have you ever asked Jesus? It's not a question of our feelings. It's a question of our will. It's an act of our will to invite Jesus to come in. If you haven't, I guess my question would be, why not? And why not this morning? And if you'd like to, or maybe you're not sure you have, you want to make certain, then why not take these words of this next prayer and just echo them in your hearts. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you're interested in me. I thank you that you want to come in. I invite you in now. I'm sorry for all the rubbish. Thank you that you can deal with it. Please take control and help me to get to know you. For I ask in Jesus' name. Amen.